India story, right from the time of the Orientalists down to the present, has often been monopolized by outsiders.
I always feel writers are ready-mades of the national stories, not the historians.
India's main gift to the world is stability, social cohesion, a democracy that is strong and decisive, and which is re-electing its leader.
The great rupture came in 2014. The Indian story became totally different.
कहानी अभी बाकी है because right now the economic story and the military story and the hard power story is yet to be played.
The opportunity is with us Indians, all of us who are storytellers. We are all ambassadors of this wonderful land of ours. Many things are aligned with us. Step up and argue and put our point of view across. We will get our story heard. You won't have to wait a few decades.
Welcome to this session on communicating the India story, communicating Viksit Bharat, communicating the many trillion-dollar story which we have all heard. And I think if some of you, like me, spent much of the morning looking at the election results, one of the recurring themes which always happens when someone wants to explain why someone didn't win as opposed to why someone won is they say, well, they didn't quite get the narrative right. Whether this was something borrowed straight from the American experience or something which is unique to Maharashtra is anybody's guess. But what's important here is that behind any important development, there is a story to be told. There is a narrative to be spun. There are the spin doctors at work. Or there are people who just speak their minds. Now, we are fortunate here in having Shekhar Gupta, who everyone knows. I don't have to give his current designation of being the main force behind the print, which is online, which is not on print. Prasannarajan, who's the editor of Open Magazine. Ashwin Sanghi, author of many whodunits, and Amish, who's recreated the epics in a modern garb. Two journalists and two novelists, although some people would say there's no real difference between the two. So Prasanna.
That's a novel thought.
So Prasanna, we'll start with you. My apologies for starting with you.
No, it's fine.
But how would you spin the story?
You know, before I start, I want to give a kind of a backstory. What is the India story? And I would begin with, if there is a narrative flow in conveying this great India story, how will you define that flow? I would say it's a crisis of representation. So it has always been there. Whenever great changes happening in the history of nations, we are always unhappy with the way it has been told, because the change is never represented according to the people who experience the change. There is always some kind of a. I think India is at that moment in history where the Indian story is, it is mostly told to the English-speaking world, not by Indians. It's a fact. Because we mostly tell the story for ourselves, but the larger English-speaking world, where the India story is an amazing story that is not invariably told by the outsiders. In its dramatization of the past and the exaggeration of the present, it is always the outsiders who get to tell the story not to our liking most of the times. So, who are the storytellers? I want to begin with the originally there are the travelers in search of the Oriental. You know, they traveled to the east, the land beyond China. It was an exotic vastness where the ritualistic Brahmins and the mendicant in ashes, and it was a great exotic land of wisdom, at the same time populated by very different people, all specimens, especially the Brahmins. That has been well documented by the people who traveled to India. Then that was followed by, I would say, there was the India story, the Catherine Mayo moment in the India story. India is as the big, incomprehensible, dirty, wretched land. That is the Catherine Mayo moment. So that story, I think she set the stage for the later institutionalization of the so-called India, the wretched land, for that Catherine Mayo story. And this story, to some extent, was retold, not totally retold. Some of its spirits were echoed by people like even Macaulay and Churchill, where the inadequacies of India as really a country struggling for freedom, are we worthy of it? That questions were asked by people like Churchill and Mayo, and more loudly and more, disagreeably explained by Catherine Mayo. And I think later the storyteller, the great shift in India for the English-speaking world came with other set of not travel, it's an outsider like V.S. Naipaul, when an area of darkness cut. But Naipaul, there's a difference. Naipaul never rejected India. It was not a repudiation of India like others. Naipaul was arguing with India. For Naipaul, India was an intimate argument, and it was a great sense of hurt he felt. And it was a great tragedy of the reality living up to his memory. That's what he felt when he traveled to this area of darkness. And he followed it up 10 years later, the post-emergency in a wounded civilization. And there, Naipaul, the great storyteller of India, and he said, the wound is created by a cult of defeat. Indians, that Hindu sense of defeat we internalize, that's a civilization. That's what he explained. And then the post-Naipaul, and at the same time, this India there is another parallel India was going on historically, that is the scholars, the real scholars for the Oriental studies, the Sanskrit India, the Maximal tradition. But I am talking about the more popular level in the portrayal of India. Then came the Midnight Children moment. India was. These are the moments when India has a story for the English-speaking world. Great story. That was also not a rejection of India. That was, to some extent, like Naipaul, it was an engagement with India. It's a love story of the ultimate Bombay Chokra. He is the grammar of his imagination, the grammar of his ancestry, like Naipaul, was very Indian, and India was an intimacy for him. And he was always arguing that's what happens when your inheritance is such an intimate, painful reality in your life. And then that's what happened. To some extent, he tried to redeem in India what we call the hyphenated to history. Okay, then there is another storyteller came, and that's a problematic storytelling. That is a writer who said that it's an end of imagination, because you are borrowing. Then this writer came. The cause, you're conscious. The writer as a professional conscience keeper, and then it is a situation where the cause desperately looks for a context. If there is no context, you create one. And it's the best example of that kind of a creation is a writer said that it's the end of an imagination. If you know the story of that word, it is a Adorno's word, and he said it after the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is such an overwhelming reality. After that, imagination is inadequate to represent it. And India I don't think in India such a situation existed. But you borrow certain catchphrases and you fix into the templates of dissent. That's what happened. It's a classical example. And then there's an explosion of, there is a profusion of Indian writing in English, in the international literary market in London and New York and everywhere. And that's not exactly, didn't follow this end of imagination theory, though it sold very well. It sold in the South Bank Festival Hall or the Guardian editorial page, but it had great takers. It had a captive audience. But then I think the great rupture came in 2014, and the Indian story became totally different. It was a great rupture. It was a reshuffling. There was a narrative subversion in the Indian story, because it changed many things. It's the first time India too was experiencing and coming face to face with one of the questions which define most of the great changes in the national evolution. Who are we? That question was, I don't know, it was answered. That question became an overwhelming experience for a majority of Indians who were living in great impatience, great grievances, great resentment. These things became, it's such a big change. And I don't know, again, whether this change was really told adequately to the world. Because, for example, when great things happen, this kind of moment happens in a Brexit or a Trump. No, it has become, there is a publishing, the great profusion of publishing in non-fiction after Trump and Brexit. Maximum, it's a golden era of the modern non-fictional writing after that, on themes like democracy, liberalism, nationalism, and where democracy is the best system, or the crack up in the liberal world and the conservative revival. Even people who question the very, these kind of things happened. But in 2014, but why this story is not adequately told. So, and when it is not told, and we have an image of India internationally, I'll stop it. And that is, again, a series of stereotypes. Because the mad nationalistic running amok, high on mythology, and this kind of an image is happening. And my question is, why this moment is captured by the Indian writers writing in English, for why we left it to the journalist or editorial pages of the liberal editorial pages. And I want to tell one point, that is some kind of a cultural protectionism in India today, because I will call it anti-Westernism. That's a paradox. Even you have to be a good argumentarian in anti-Westernism, you have to do it in English. So that's what's happening in India. So why our writing, some of the great Indian stories being told, why we are telling ourselves? Why you are living in this massive echo chamber of India? So you have to take it outside like this great moment. And because that's a question we have to answer. And I think, I feel the writers, like the Latin America, what happened in Latin America or what happened in Russia, I always feel writers are ready-mades of the national stories, not the historians. We know the great Russian story by Dostoevsky, and we know the great Latin American story by Garcia Marquez. So writers are the ready-mades.
Okay, I think I think there are some very interesting points you made.
Yeah.
One of the major points is that, by and large, the India story, chronologically right from the time of the Orientalists down to the present, has often been monopolized by outsiders, number one. Speaking in a language speaking in an idiom rather, which is completely alien. Secondly, there's been a great deal of preoccupation with the exotic India, the romantic India, maybe the sanitary inspectors India, and such like. And the India which has come up of late, more assertive India, has not yet found its voice. It's still struggling to find. But let me ask Amish a question. And Amish didn't want to be the first speaker, so I deliberately shied away from that. You've concentrated most of your time in interpreting or repackaging the epics for a contemporary audience, but primarily an Indian audience. And Prasanna made the point that Indians are caught in an echo chamber. Do you think that the first purpose of getting the India story right is by actually creating an India story in the minds of Indians to answer the question which he asked, who are we? What does your experience tell you?
Look, my books sell in a reasonable number abroad as
Oh,
well,
it
but it's
sells
not.
me-
But it's not
It
just
sells
about,
by the ton.
Nah, but
it doesn't
but it's
sell
not
numbers.
actually. I'm talking about as actually storytellers and authors. I think Prasanna is absolutely right. The India story for the last few centuries has been told by foreigners. Foreigners convinced us, for example, that India was never a country. The British built us, which is nonsense. But many Indians believed it. It did not change post 1947 because there were Indians who were speaking in English, who were primarily driving our literature, our textbooks. Many who've written, I'm sure many are aware, those who've written our seminal history books actually didn't know Sanskrit, some of them. I don't want to name them, but we know who they are. So they were dependent on British translations of our original texts. This was the situation that India was stuck in. So actually the story that we started telling ourselves as well was defined by the British because our textbooks were written by the native English speakers in India, which were then translated into Indian languages, which is why many Indians also believe that maybe the British created us, or maybe sati has been a tradition for thousands of years, it's all our fault. These things which can be very easily challenged. Now what has started changing post 1991, the way I see it. Normally, to use the much abused term of soft power, I mean, essentially what is telling our own story is that we will have our own soft power, right? Normally, soft power tends to follow hard power by a few decades. America was already richer than the UK by the late 19th, early 20th century, but it still didn't take over, right? Because there's a bit of time lag when a country actually becomes powerful and then starts realizing that actually have become powerful. And I can drive my own story. In India, I find our cultural conversation from the Indian side has started early, right? Perhaps a reason for that is China and India, our scale is so big. You know, as Rhythm was just saying right now, sorry, Ashish was saying right now, at $3,000, we have the kind of capital markets that many other countries would have had at $10,000, $15,000. Why? Because our scale is so big, it allows the creation of institutions. Perhaps it allows the creation of enough of a market for storytellers as well. That's the first part, I think, that's happening. The second part that's happening is, I think, what has happened in the last few decades. There's been a rise of a generation who can speak English like natives as well, but their heart is Indian, right? Many of us, in my family, we are the first generation which was educated in the English medium. My parents were educated in the Hindi medium, right? And their entire thing was कि हम तुम्हें कॉन्वेंट स्कूल में भेजना चाहते हैं ताकि तुम अंग्रेजी वालों के सामने सहमोगे नहीं. That one of the things my mother used to tell me again and again. At home we spoke in Hindi, but outside we would speak in English, right? So we speak Hindi and English as natives. What does that mean? There's a big bunch of English speakers now, millions of English speakers, who, unlike in the previous generation, whose heart had also gone British, in our generation we speak English like natives, but our heart is Indian. That has caused a radical shift in the way debates happen with the West, which didn't happen with China, because China didn't have millions of speakers who can speak English like natives. Okay, so if we're in the UK, we're in the US, some Westerner says things which are patently nonsensical, right? If my English wasn't good enough, I wouldn't be able to argue with him. If it is, we can. And we argue on social media as well. That's a third thing that's happened. Earlier, the difference, the challenge in getting your story across was usually the declining power, the status quo power, always controlled the gatekeepers, right? There was a reason why America actually anglicized itself. Many don't know this. The dominant genetic group in America is actually not British Americans, actually German Americans, right? But the dominant cultural narrative was anglicization at that time. So America actually anglicized itself, right? Why? Because the gatekeepers of knowledge of everyone at that time was the British. The gatekeepers who control knowledge today. If I want to get written in New York Times, I'd have to speak their idiom, right? Which is the third thing that's happened. Social media has broken the power of those
You
gatekeepers.
also have to get their argument,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, to replicate their argument.
Absolutely. So social media has broken the power of the gatekeepers. Earlier, a very powerful journalist in New York Times or Financial Times, if he wrote an article running down India, that would be taken as gospel truth. Today, someone writes an article saying Tulsi Gabbard is from an obscure
Religious cult.
which one? I don't know what term he used. I think
Religious cult.
obscure religious cult. Okay. Ashwin Sanghi posted a tweet
Don't
which
quote
went
that, please. I've already received so
which
much
went
pushback.
viral, and he said obscure religious cult. Hindus are 1.2 billion people. Now that journalist would have gotten away with it, all right, 20 years ago. Today, in the age of social media, he can't, and he will think 20 times before writing something like this in his next article. That is the third thing that's happened, which is actually probably helping us. So the way I see it, the opportunity is with us Indians, all of us who are storytellers. We are all ambassadors of this wonderful land of ours. Many things are aligned with us. Step up and argue and put our point of view across. We will get our story heard. We won't have to wait a few decades.
I think that's very forcefully expressed. I think the shift which has taken place. Another shift, if I may come to you, Shekhar, and this is something which you've been talking about, if not writing about, for a long time, which is that there was a view of India which was mired in backwardness, which was mired in poverty, dirt, squalor, etc. And a lot of Indians actually celebrated that. Povertarianism is one word which often comes to mind. We've moved away from that. We've now become far more assertive, not merely culturally, politically, I think, but equally economically as well. Has that made a difference in communicating that story to the wider world? A self-confident India, which is materially self-confident as well, apart from being the great spiritual repository it always was.
Well, what you're saying is in a sense correct, but I wish it was also true on the ground. Because what's happened with us is we are in the early stages of this new confidence. So right now we are spending too much time, energy, attention and emotion selling the India story to fellow Indians. One, we haven't built enough voices. Voices take time growing in the global debating space. So not enough voices have come up to take this story forward. And second, the smart voices that are there in India, they are looking at retweets in India. You have to address a larger audience globally. Now, India has a big story to tell. This is a world that's really hassled right now because they see instability, they see wars, they see this rise of nationalism everywhere. Europe's a mess. What's India? So if you ask me, if a foreign audience asks me, what does India bring to the world? What is India's gift to the world? India's gift to the world, number one, 7% growth is great. On $3.6 trillion economy, that's a good base, 7%, but that is not India's main gift. India's main gift to the world is stability and cohesion. Stability, social cohesion, democracy, which is getting stronger by the day. Democracy, which is getting stronger, decisive, a society that's getting more cohesive. the stories and aberrations are all reported, but that is not the mainstream story of India. The mainstream story of India is that if you go back and look at all the states that came into being after the Second World War in the world, only 2.5 have stayed intact of the multicultural states. And those 2.5 are, half is Indonesia because East Timor broke away, one is Tanzania, and the third is India. But look at the diversity and the size of India. India has not only stayed together, but India has become stronger with the passage of every decade. I would say that India today is the strongest I have seen, and I am 67, right? India, I saw 10 years back, was the strongest India until then. I'm a child of the 60s. I saw 3 wars, I saw ship-to-mouth existence, I saw all deaths of 2 prime ministers in office, right? The death of a president in office. With all of that, look where India has come. That's really the big India story. And sometimes we undermine that story by saying, oh, deep state is trying to undermine us. Somebody is trying to carry out a regime change. Arey, kisi ka baap ka himmat nahi hai. India is not some chota-mota state that somebody can carry out a regime change. So those are things that we communicate backwards to our own followers in India. Who's speaking to the world on our behalf is the question. So the message, as I said, 1, stability, social cohesion, a democracy that is strong and decisive, and which is re-electing its leader. So all over the world, if you look at all over the world, incumbents are losing, right? India is a rare country where the incumbent is winning. This incumbent, irrespective of who votes for whom, this incumbent is the senior most democratically elected leader in the whole world. You see all those group photos. Now, it's credit to him, but it's also credit to the Indian democracy, because Indian democracy is very strong. Next point, we are now in the 3rd phase of nation building. I don't think anybody is saying this to the rest of the world. The first phase was Nehru, then all the states and everything, India was put together. Second phase was Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh economic reform. The 3rd phase of nation building has gone on now for 10 years. And that's the story to be told to the whole world, not some incident here or incident there. India's global heft is increasing and it's only going up. Second, you see now the rise of world leaders aligned in a new coalition ideology, a new coalition of ideology. And what is this ideology? This ideology is nation first. So this old consensus over a flat world globalization is broken. So this is nation first. What does India do in this nation first situation? India has to stay nation first, but India has to say, look, but if you are good to India, if you invest in India, if you look at India with respect and awe, which India deserves, you are actually serving your own national interest. You are not doing it as a lip service to globalization. Earlier it was, because it's globalization, you must do something in India. No, you want to serve your national interest. You cannot serve your national interest unless you do something in India. So these are the messages that need to go down, because the old post-World War II consensus has now broken down. And the new consensus is now emerging for India. I mean, it's a bad metaphor to use, but it's a black swan, perfect storm event in global politics, geopolitics, which is totally to India's advantage if India plays to it. But the important thing is sometimes we are like people who declare victory too soon, right? And that's how our hockey teams used to, after leading 3-0, concede 4 goals in the last 3 minutes, right? So we declare victory too soon. So we have to take a deep breath and focus. We missed the first rush of China +1 to Vietnam of all countries. We should not miss the second rush, because this will go on for a long time, and don't let anything distract any of us. At the same time, we have to avoid delusion, rhetoric, defensiveness, surliness. That's when we talk to the world. It may work well domestically. So this nonsensical talk of deep state is out to undermine India. Deep state could not undermine India in 1960s. How can it undermine India now? Second, de-dollarization. I mean, dollar is very good for India, right? So why de-dollarization at a time when China is launching dollar bonds, dollar sovereign bonds in Saudi Arabia? Why is this fantasy about de-dollarization? And if you talk about de-dollarization, BRICS currency, which will be a yuan currency, right? Because if BRICS is 30% of global GDP, then China is 80% of that BRICS GDP. So India does not have to fall into the trap. This deglobalization or rise of nation first is very useful for India. And that's why India must look more confident, must look not just indestructible, but a rising power. That said, I will just say one more thing in conclusion. Who tells the India story to the world? We can keep on telling it, but all of us will have limitations telling the India story to the world. Global voices have to tell the India story also to their own world. Now, compare the situation today with how it was, say, until 3 decades back. Ram is here. Ram, until 3 decades back, the greatest scholars on Indian politics, Indian economics, Indian subcontinent's geopolitical issues were all in Western academia. So, Myron Weiner, Leo Rose, Paul Brass, Lloyd and Susan, Rudolph, Jim Maynard, Steve Cohen, all of them have gone. All of them have gone. In the critical times, they were seen by the left establishment at that point. They were viewed with suspicion and very often denied visas. But when Bangladesh happened in 71, those are the ones who spoke up for India in an American system which was very hostile to India. So India has lost out on this big support base. What's happened on the other hand is it's very good for native Indian origin people, but all of the Western academia researching the subcontinent, to the extent that I can, I ban the use of the expression South Asia, because I think at some point think tanks invented this expression South Asia, because there are lots of countries south of us in Asia. So on the subcontinent, the loss of genuine Western scholars on the subcontinent is a setback to India. And we talk about deep state. We have to build our own deep state. What is to stop India from building its deep state? You want to build a deep state? You get Indian corporates to set up chairs in global universities. Don't give those chairs to Indian scholars. Find useful global scholars who will not always say what you want them to say, but who will have a stake in the India story, because everybody needs to be given a vested interest. The international scholars lost interest in the India story because funding stopped. That was the Cold War funding. Cold War ended, the funding stopped. That funding can now come from India, and that will help build the India story. The other thing is, take the India story to the neighborhood. Now, Pakistan's a challenge, let them be. But if we were to become a deep state, why are we not doing what the Americans did with the Soviets in the Cold War, or what the Americans and the Europeans and the Brits and the Germans do all the time with the rest of the world, including our country, which is to give scholarships, get scholars in, get students in. Some will be hostile, some will be write stuff you will not like, but you will build a living constituency for yourself. And second, you will build a vested interest, because there is 200 scholars in Bangladesh will be thinking, I need a scholarship, I need to get out of Bangladesh, where do I go? So maybe it's tough for me to go to the US, it's too competitive. Canada is all fake, right? Because Trudeau himself has said that most of his universities are fake and diploma factories, right? The Brits have no money. India should have the money for the neighborhood. And at some point, let the Pakistanis feel bad. Even Afghans are going there, right? Nepalese are going there. I mean, what do I see in this situation? I've been around a long time and I've seen this picture from both sides. Today, it's the Indian scholars and Indian journalists, particularly refugees from journalism, the people who no longer have full-time, well-paying jobs. There is strong FCRA restrictions in India. So the foundations, the global foundations, have built foundations in our neighboring countries. Look at a big foundation in Nepal, for example. Big foundation in Nepal, which is not only inviting Indian scholars, Indian journalists, but also giving them assignments. So I will give you an example without naming any names. The story was carried in a big national paper, Indian national paper, probably because it cost them so money and because all environmental stories look great. And this was a long story over 2 full pages on how the maritime shipping in the Ganga was going to kill the Gangetic dolphin. Right? If you read that story, the last line said, this story was funded by such and such foundation, by a grant from such and such foundation. I thought about it yesterday because yesterday stories came out that Gangetic dolphin has made its appearance after 30 years in Patna, right? And we sent a reporter to cover it. So I remembered this. This grant, the foundation that made this grant is not an American foundation. It's a foundation in Nepal, right? It's a foundation in Nepal. So the American foundation will give money to the foundation in Nepal and see the number of South Asia conferences, which just burns my heart. South Asia conferences being held in Nepal. So, in fact, last week there was a tweet from a well-known international expert, strategic affairs expert, saying, what are the Bangladeshis doing? Why are they resuming shipping with Pakistan when they should be improving the relations with India, etc., etc., etc.? What is Yunus government doing? To which I responded, I rarely speak on Twitter now, I'm on Twitter sannyas. I said that Yunus administration's main priority seems to be trolling India, then fixing things in Bangladesh, and there's a lot wrong in Bangladesh. So see who has responded to it, saying that, oh, if Bangladesh and Pakistan are making up after decades of bitterness, what's your problem? You Indians are so insecure that you also don't want the return of SARC. So this is a voice from Nepal. Why is India Foundation not doing stuff like this? It should be easy to raise money for things like this. Why are we not magnet for scholars, students, journalists from Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives? Everybody loves a junket, right? So many Indians love a junket, so we have to presume our neighbors also love junkets, and also Americans, the Brits, particularly those who want to study South Asia, they love junkets, but there's no funding for them now for this work. And that is where we need to take the India story overseas. There's no point continuing to tell the India story to ourselves.
I think that's an important point Shekhar has made about how we've imposed limits on ourselves to how much we can reach outwards, and that we never lose an opportunity to lose an opportunity. And that it's the lack of ambition, the lack of foresight, which is holding India back at the moment. Ashwin, as someone who's otherwise a creative writer, but who is involved in the larger public discussion, do you think that we are temperamentally too insular?
Well, my position is that, frankly, we can easily rewind the clock and go back a few thousand odd years. And we are, in that sense, a nation of storytellers. So I find it rather ironic that we are not able to tell our story, or the fact that we are having to sit here for a session to deliberate on how to communicate the India or the Bharat story. But I think partly, Swapanda, that relates back to the fact that we are a dharmic civilization. And there is nothing like an absolute truth when it comes down to the dharmic world. So there is no one church, there is no one holy book, there is no one pope. There are 33 kotis, there's no one true God who will damn you into eternity. You can comfortably decide that you want to make the Buddha into the 9th avatar of Vishnu. You absorb him along the way. You will bow your head down before a gurdwara or a masjid or a temple equally. You may worship a rock or a stone. You may say that, Ashwin, this is a shivling, and I may say, Swapanta, this shivling is a stone. We are both welcome. You could be Nastic, Astic, Tantric, or simply fantastic. All of us are welcome, right? So this is the wonderful thing about the civilization that we are part of. You could believe in Shakti, Bhakti, Yantra, Tantra, Mantra, none of the above, it doesn't matter. All are different spiritual paths. Now, it is precisely because of that we were able to get our story across great swaths of civilization. You have a single work which starts out as the Valmiki Ramayana, which then becomes a Tulsi's Ramcharitmanas, which then also becomes the Adbhut Ramayana, the Anand Ramayana, the Mapila Muslim Ramayana, it becomes the Jain Ramayana, the Lao Ramayana, and then eventually reaches Indonesia and Cambodia and Burma and right all the way up to Japan and China. Which means, in other words, we had the capacity to make our story travel. But the stories that traveled were slightly different. They were differentiated stories. The ultimate story was the victory of good over evil. But those stories, we made them travel. And that is what then brings me to the fact that if we go back to what we nowadays, it's a politically charged term, Akhand Bharat. But I don't see Akhand Bharat as the political definition that it is, but a wide Vedic arc. So if you really think about it, for example, you have an area in Afghanistan called Kandahar, but we've forgotten that it is Gandhari who gives you the name Kandahar, or where, etymologically,
And
where does
Shakuni.
that come from?
And Shakuni.
And Shakuni. Similarly, for example, the world, the land of Iran, we have forgotten that Aryanim Vaija was the root of Iran. Or, for example, the world's largest Hindu temple is not located in India, but is located in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. We go back to 1380 BC and we find that around the area of Turkey, there are ancient tribes, the Hittanis and the Mitanni, the Hittis and the Mitanni, who are getting into a peace treaty and they are invoking Varuna, Mitra, and Indra in their peace negotiations. You have a deity like Varuna in India, in Bharat, who is then adopted by the Greeks as Uranus. And the Romans love the friend to Varuna, that is Mitra, even more, and they accommodate him as a Roman deity, Mitra. So there was a huge traveling of civilization and stories in the ancient age. But then comes a time when suddenly everything switches. And what is that switch that happens? For example, it took less than a century for Zoroastrianism to be wiped out from Persia. The Mithraic cults of Rome died when Christianity came. Who remembers Egypt's Ra and Osiris today? Zeus, Apollo, where are they? The tribal belief systems of the Aborigines in Australia, who remembers them? The point is, we are talking about the fact that India was punching above its weight in ancient times. We weren't. We already had hard power, economic power, military power, which then enabled us to transfer our soft power. Here, we seem to be putting the cart before the horse. I'm sorry, I'm going to be disagreeing with a lot of my friends here. Till the time that we haven't built up our ability to have hard power, and we are getting there. But once we have that, let me tell you, the story will follow. You know, there is that old saying, no? Kahani abhi baki hai. Literally speaking, kahani abhi baki hai, because right now the economic story and the military story and the hard power story is yet to be played. You see a country like the US, the Israel lobby, I think Jews account for some 2% of the American population. Yet 1/2 of the 800 billionaires in the US are Jewish. Which means, in other words, that the US can unilaterally decide that they wish to switch their ambassador from one city to another without raising an eyebrow. They can move to Jerusalem, or for that matter, in a single year, you can spend $17 billion in military aid on Israel. Why can you do that? Because there is a lobby. The truth of the world is that we have lost our ability to be able to influence many, many key sectors. It starts with academia. We have a generation that has grown up not understanding the value of our civilization. Our history books have been pathetic, and that is notwithstanding 10 years of the BJP government. We have a situation where kids see our history as a series of losses and conquests. We have still not set that right. Maybe the answer, Swapada, is just keep on quietly doing your work in terms of getting your economic and military might right, and set the narrative right in the sectors that really are important: academia, media, and probably entertainment. There has been no sector greater than Hollywood in terms of setting narratives. So maybe that's the parallel effort that we need to make along with our economic and military effort.
I think I won't be exaggerating if I say the multiple ideas which have come across from these 4 different but yet complementary interventions is something to think about. But I've been told that one of the shortcomings of an earlier session was that there was no engagement with the audience. And I want to set that right in this particular session. So instead of having a further cross-conversation, I'm going to ask for actually people to, for questions. So if we can have a show of hands, then we can. Okay, Rajiv.
My name is Rajiv Srinivasan. Which story you're talking about? Because there are multiple stories. There is the India story that you've concentrated on, which is the economic story, as Ashwin ji mentioned, the military story, etc. But that's under attack from Hindenburg and other sources. Like just a couple of days ago, you saw what happened with Adani being under attack. So that's being attacked on the one hand. Second, there is the Hindu story, which, as was mentioned by Amish ji, under attack. Tulsi Gabbard attacks the Hindu story. Audrey Trushke attacks the Hindu story. And then there's the Bharatiya story. I wrote an article with my friend Abhishek for Mr. Prasannarajan in Open Magazine about Ayurveda and allopathy. And then we ran ChatGPT on it. It did not even have the word Ayurveda coming out in the ChatGPT summary. So Indian or Bharatiya knowledge is being negated and being exterminated. So there are multiple stories that are being attacked. So which one? Because you've only talked about the India story. So what about the Hindu story? And what about the Bharatiya story? Thank you.
Beautiful.
Okay, before you answer, let's hit a cluster of questions and then we can. Okay, the lady, Surabhi.
I want to add to the stories list. And I really believe that one of our biggest storytellers abroad are our diaspora. The type of stories that I see coming out of the diaspora are also divergent in terms of their life experiences, the reasons why they left the country, which state they come from. A lot of the people in the diaspora have strong regional values as well. So I'm curious to hear, do you see those differentiations? There are also economic differentiations in diaspora audiences, right? There are certain diaspora communities that have migrated at an earlier time, have more economic power. Do you see that as an important factor, and how does that come together?
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Ritvik Shastri. So I'm a first PUC student. The discussion that was done by all the erudite panelists was really fantastic. But my question here is how Amish Tripathi ji, you mentioned about English education and about different types of colonial consciousness that we have. Same with you as well, ji. So my question would be, how would we slowly come out of this kind of colonial consciousness where we, till today, we converse fluently in English, as you mentioned? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Two more questions we'll take, and then we'll try and...
May I ask?
My name is Nishant Azad and I cover politics for Organizer Weekly. As you said that democracy is getting stronger and stronger day by day. But there is a section in our society that they believe that constitution as well as democracy is in danger. What is your take on this?
Hello, sir. My question is to Shekhar Gupta ji. You said India should fund and make some English people or somebody. Some funding should be done so that the other country people also write for us in a positive way. That's what I heard. Actually, whenever I see any UK magazine or something, they'll keep the author's photo to the side and they say he's not funded from so and so, he has no vested interest, no conflict of interest, everything they write. That is one thing which we like, because it should come spontaneously, not with funding. If some politician, journalist write anything, we see, okay, he is taking the line. That's what is there.
One final question.
Okay. My name is Sandhya, and I want to take further up from the diaspora point. I have lived for almost 30 years in the Middle East and back here. There is a story running in the Middle East as well, between UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so on, which I've documented in a book. Amish has a copy of that. But the stories have a time scale. How far back do you go to start your story? So if you started 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, what is in the memory and what is the time scale that one starts a story in, is my question.
So my name is Shashwat, and in 2013, when I read the Shiva trilogy, it was very interesting to see, to actually imagine Shiv like that. And, it opened many, I would say, like, many new doors for the imagination and for the culture that we've never actually thought about it like that. Shiva as a cool person and all of that. But now I feel that in the sense of we establishing our culture, and we're also talking about cultural protectionism. So how do we see the stories of India, which will be put out internationally? Like Shiva trilogy was a bestseller in India. But like abroad, how do we see that happening?
One more question.
Yeah. Please.
Right, so I am General Shukla. It was
And
a
after that,
remarkably
that's it.
interesting conversation. And I just wish to make one observation and then seek a response. See how and this is in the strategic military dimension. See how the West works its story. So they have, say, Shangri-La, they have Munich Security Conference. But their follow-up action is extremely pathetic. And I've observed the Chinese. You go to the Munich Security Conference, Shangri-La, London, they'll have huge teams of the PLA, 12 people, 15 people. They don't have a Beijing security dialogue. They don't tell the story. But from these storytelling events, they see what needs to be done. And their execution exceeds the story. So you have the West, whose military is an opera of failing deterrence. And you have China, who's taking lessons from these stories. So perhaps the story is important, but the execute piece must be linked to the story, or else it'll be of little value. Thank you.
What value will Bangladeshi scholars impart to Indo-Bangladeshi relationships?
Okay, let's. I don't know who wants to start the ball rolling. Okay, we've got a multiple.
Most of the questions are
you can
directed
answer
to-
anybody, even though the questions may have been directed at particular individuals. Anyone can take it up.
Maybe I lost
Okay.
track of some of the questions, so I'll quickly attempt three. One is that people oppose us, economically, militarily. And one of the things I think we Indians have to accept and understand, why should anyone make it easy for us? No great power has just been invited onto the table. If we have to get onto the big boys' table, we have to fight our way in. And one of the things that I genuinely believe is muscles grow against resistance. If you don't exercise your muscles against resistance, they atrophy. Others will oppose us. Why should they make it easy for us? We should see that as good, because it means we have to fight our way in, which means we have to improve, which actually reinforces a point that Shekhar made, which I agree with, that we have to be far more serious about our economic growth, about our national unity, about our military capabilities, and opposition will make us serious about that. Second thing was on language. That's one thing I remember. You should speak English like a native. Make sure you speak your own language like a native as well, your mother tongue too. I can speak in Hindi very comfortably. I can go on a Jagran Manch and speak properly in Hindi out there. There are Kannadigas out here. You must speak your Kannada language perfectly. You must be able to read and write as well, not just speak. I find many youngsters are reading. I don't know if it's happening in Kannada. I know North India, many youngsters are reading our mother tongue in the Roman script. I don't know if it's happening in Kannada. Okay? And the Indian languages are phonetic, scientific languages. How you pronounce it actually changes the meaning. It's not like English. English is a mongrel language, right? Pronunciation doesn't change the meaning as much. If you're reading your language in the Roman script, you mess up the pronunciations. Hindi में त, थ, ठ का कुछ फर्क नहीं है. न, ड़ तो भूल ही जाओ. So you change the meaning. You find so many saying Vasudev Kutumbakam instead of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. मतलब क्या बोल रहे हो यार? Okay. But they don't read in Devanagari, so they don't know what they're saying. So don't give up English. I'm not anti-English. It's very good for you. Know your own mother tongue as perfectly as well. And that is within our hands. Last thing on the Indian immigrants who went abroad. There's actually a documentary idea I have. My wife Shivani and I, we've been discussing it. There's something that struck me. Indian immigrants have gone abroad over the last few centuries. Some went practically as slaves. The indentured labor was basically slavery with British characteristics. Let's be very clear. Okay. Some went as immigrants in the Raj era. Some went as immigrants in the 60s. Some went recently. One of the things you find as a common pattern of Indian immigrants across the world, whether they're in Fiji Islands, Southeast Asia, South Africa, Hong Kong, Canary Islands, US, UK, everywhere. Indians jump forward a few generations, we are right at the top. No matter, even if we went as slaves to the Caribbean islands. Crime rates are among the lowest there is, education levels among the highest, income levels among the highest, right? It's not genetic. What is the reason why Indians do this? Because it's not genetics. Because the Pakistanis have the same genetics as us. They like to think they're descendants of Turks. They're not. They're descendants of Indians, basically. But Pakistanis in every single country they're at are right at the bottom, right? Lowest education, economic achievement, highest crime rates. It's not religion, because Indian Muslims are also right at the top, right? You find Bori Muslims right at the top. So there's something that is magical about Indian culture. We need to analyze that. Our immigrants are actually giving us a real, practical, experimental proof that there's something that's perhaps worth researching. What is it about Indians that we tend to succeed? Sorry.
Anyone else to sort of compliment, disagree with the various interventions that have been made?
I think Prasanna's been quiet for too long.
No. I spoke. I just, somebody was talking about which India you are talking about. I think the beauty of being India is the multiplicity of it. As Swapan earlier said, that there's not one idea of India, there is ideas of India, that is, because the virtue of being non-homogeneous in all its polyphonic exuberance.
What Ashwin was talking about.
Huh?
what Ashwin was talking
Yeah,
about.
this-
It's a
this-
shivling and a stone.
Yeah, so the many accents of India, because somebody said that when somebody speaks English with an accent, which means he knows one more language. So
Everyone has an accent.
so everybody know one more? No, one more language. That today is the world. When a Frenchman speaks English or a German speaks English, that means it's a rootedness. That what I meant was that India, the sheer polyphonic exuberance of India, being the plurality of India, that is what holds us together. This so-called Indianness, which you much talked about that. There must be something there, this non-homogeneous entity with so much chaotic culture. There is something which is still a study in being India in the world, because it's democracy with this kind of so many fault lines. And that is the story. That's the story. It's never fully told. That's it.
I just want to add one thing, which was related to something which someone said about the diaspora. Even within the diaspora, the multiplicity of stories. Like, for example, I find it fascinating that the average Canadian doesn't seem to have an idea of the Kanishka bombing. Such a huge historical gap that the greatest terror attack.
Even Trudeau doesn't.
Exactly.
But you're talking about...
Even Trudeau doesn't. And I have to say this with the greatest.
He was talking about the average American,
I know.
not the below average.
Exactly.
But even the Canadian High Commissioner who just left, who was a career diplomat, he had zero idea. So sometimes.
So, but isn't there a gap in our storytelling, even in terms of what the diaspora should have been remembering?
No, but diaspora is confused, because diaspora in Canada is doing many things, right? And there is a Sikh diaspora and there is a Hindu diaspora. A lot of the Hindu diaspora is too busy building careers. All that's fine. But who has kept this story alive in Sri Lanka and in Canada? It's just that one journalist. Just that one Canadian journalist.
Correct.
Who's kept at it right from 1985.
You're talking of Terry
Terry Milewski. Since 1984. He should be a national hero in India, right? He should be offered Padma Awards. He should be a national hero. And there have to be ways found to set up projects on researching this, on researching the families of the victims. Now, one son of the parents who died, Sanjay Lazar, he's continuing this campaign. But there are at least couple of thousand like that. And most of them were Canadian citizens. So that is something that India can do. But India is not doing it. So countries forget their embarrassments. Kanishka was a Canadian embarrassment. It was an embarrassment socially, politically, and also for their intelligence and for their security. The only reason they've been able to forget it conveniently is because people were of Indian origin. If these were Canadians, would not be the case. So these are stories to be kept alive in many different ways. The point you're making is very correct. But do we in India remember this story? Most people in India forgot. Is there a Kanishka memorial in India?
Yeah.
It took Harper to set up a Kanishka memorial in Cork, in Ireland, right, and go there. But why is there no Kanishka memorial in India? There should be Kanishka memorial in Amritsar or Jalandhar.
Correct.
That would be a message to the Sikh community as well. But why? I mean, why it's 40 years gone, but can be done now. So first of all, Indians questioning the attacks on the constitution, saying there is insecurity, saying there is communalism, saying this is wrong, inequality, is a very healthy thing. This actually contributes to yours being a robust democracy. China calls itself a democracy, right? I mean, but it's also 97% one race and dictatorship of one party, right? So democracy must have different voices coming out. That's one. Second, ma'am, what you said, India does not have to, no Indian foundation has to say this story on Bangladesh was done by so and so, or this story on India was done by. But I will give you a very simple example. One of the European countries are at the forefront of lecturing the world on climate change. One of the greatest damages to climate change cause has been done by the Greens in Germany. When Greens became part of the ruling coalition, first condition was Germany will stop producing nuclear power. So they shut down all their nuclear power. What are they doing? They are burning coal instead. So that's a story that most Indian media will not have the resources to do. But that is, and that's not a story that a foundation in Nepal would pay for, right? But stories like those need to be told. The same Germany is now buying nuclear power from France happily. So these are important things. And ma'am, what you said about Bangladesh, a Bangladeshi scholar will not go back and praise India. But over a period of time, you will build a cadre of people who have had the India experience, who have a vested interest in India, and who think they can write a recommendation, get my nephew something in India, or get somebody something in India, or I have my friends. Learn from how the Americans won the Cold War. They won the Cold War by co-opting the Soviets. They co-opted the Soviets to such an extent that Gorbachev ended up at Harvard University. So you have to learn to co-opt your rivals, your friends, everybody in a perfectly legal, legitimate and time-tested way. That's all I say.